The deafening rotor wash kicked up clouds of dust as the faded Sikorsky UH-60 Black Hawk descended onto the forward operating base in eastern Afghanistan. The helicopter's exterior was weathered, patches of mismatched paint covering decades of repairs. Sergeant Madison Hayes guided the ancient bird to a perfect landing, the grace of her movements contradicting the aircraft's battered appearance. The new recruits watched from the edge of the landing zone, snickering among themselves. None of them realized they were mocking a living legend whose combat record would soon leave them speechless. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Forward Operating Base Condor sprawled across a dusty plateau in Afghanistan's Kunar province, a collection of concrete barriers, prefabricated structures, and makeshift facilities that had grown organically over years of continuous operations. The morning sun cast harsh shadows across the helicopter landing zone as Lieutenant Cameron Foster led his squad of fresh-faced flight engineers toward the maintenance hangar. "This is where you'll be spending most of your time," Foster announced, his voice carrying just enough authority to remind the recruits of his rank. "Try not to break anything expensive on your first day." The squad of 6 engineers had arrived at Operating Condor just 2 days earlier, their crisp uniforms and eager expressions marking them as newcomers, more clearly than any identification badges. They'd graduated at the top of their class from Fort Rucker, the Army's premier aviation training facility, and each carried the confidence of those who excelled in controlled environments, but had yet to face the unpredictable challenges of a combat zone. Private First Class Alex Mercer stood at the center of the group, his posture relaxed despite the formal setting. At 24, he had already established himself as the unofficial leader among the new arrivals, his technical knowledge and easy charisma drawing the others into his orbit. "They actually fly these relics?" Mercer whispered to Private Sarah Chun as they approached a row of helicopters in various states of repair. "I thought most of these would be in museums by now." Chun stifled a laugh. "My grandfather flew something like that in Desert Storm." The hangar doors stood open, revealing a cavernous space filled with the organized chaos of military aviation maintenance. Mechanics moved purposefully between workstations, the air heavy with the scent of hydraulic fluid and aviation fuel. In the far corner, partially obscured by scaffolding, sat a Black Hawk helicopter that had clearly seen better days. Unlike the other aircraft in the hangar, which were painted in uniform desert camouflage, this particular UH-60 wore a patchwork of repairs and replacement panels. Its call sign, Valkyrie, was stenciled beneath the cockpit window in faded lettering that had been repainted multiple times. As the recruits approached, they noticed a woman in her late 30s working methodically on one of the helicopter's engines. Her olive-drab flight suit was worn but immaculately maintained, the name Hayes embroidered above her left breast pocket. Her dark hair was pulled back in a tight bun, revealing a thin scar that ran from her left temple down to her jawline. "And this," Lieutenant Foster said, gesturing toward the woman, "is Sergeant Madison Hayes, one of our senior pilots and maintenance specialists. She'll be overseeing your practical training during your deployment." Sergeant Hayes looked up from her work, acknowledging the group with a brief nod before returning her attention to the engine components spread across her workstation. Her movements were precise and economical, each tool selected and used with practiced efficiency. Mercer exchanged glances with the other recruits, a smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. The helicopter Sergeant Hayes was working on looked like it belonged in a scrapyard, not an active combat zone. The contrast between the advanced aircraft they'd trained on at Fort Rucker and this relic was almost comical. "Sergeant Hayes," Lieutenant Foster continued, "these are the new flight engineers I mentioned. They've just completed their advanced training and will be joining the maintenance rotation effective immediately." Hayes wiped her hands on a rag and approached the group. Her expression remained neutral as she assessed the new arrivals, her eyes revealing nothing of her thoughts. "Welcome to FOB Condor," she said simply. "I hope your training was thorough. We don't have time for remedial lessons out here." Her voice carried a quiet authority that gave Mercer pause, but only momentarily. The condition of her aircraft had already formed his opinion of her capabilities. Anyone still flying a helicopter in that state couldn't possibly be at the cutting edge of military aviation. "Is that your bird, Sergeant?" Mercer asked, gesturing toward the patched-up Black Hawk. "It is," Hayes replied without elaboration. "Looks like it's seen better days," Mercer commented, keeping his tone just respectful enough to avoid an outright reprimand. Sergeant Hayes studied him for a moment, her expression unreadable. "Valkyrie has earned her battle scars," she said. "Finally, just like the rest of us." Lieutenant Foster cleared his throat, sensing the undercurrent of tension. "Sergeant Hayes has more flight hours in combat conditions than most pilots in this entire forward operating base," he said pointedly. "You'd do well to learn everything she's willing to teach you." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Mercer nodded, but the slight tilt of his head conveyed skepticism rather than acknowledgement. He'd trained on the latest helicopter systems, studied the most advanced aviation technology the Army had to offer. What could he possibly learn from someone flying an aircraft that looked ready for retirement? "Lieutenant," Hayes said, turning to Foster, "if you don't mind, I'd like to get these engineers oriented to our maintenance protocols immediately. We've got 3 birds due for critical systems checks before tomorrow's operations." "Of course, Sergeant," Foster replied. "They're all yours." He gave the recruits a final appraising look before departing, his expression making it clear he expected them to give Sergeant Hayes their full attention and respect. As soon as Foster was out of earshot, Hayes addressed the group. "Each of you has been assigned to a specific maintenance team. Your schedules are posted in the crew room. Before you touch a single component on aircraft, you'll observe experienced engineers for a minimum of 3 days." Her gaze swept across the recruits, lingering momentarily on Mercer. "Questions?" "No questions, Sergeant," Chun responded quickly, shooting a warning glance at Mercer. "Good. Report to your team leaders and begin your observation shifts." "Mercer, you're with me today." The other recruits dispersed, leaving Mercer standing alone with Sergeant Hayes beside her weathered helicopter. He straightened his posture, determined to maintain his professional demeanor despite his doubts about her expertise. "You've got that look," Hayes said unexpectedly as she returned to her workstation. "What look is that, Sergeant?" "The one that says you think you know more than the person instructing you." She picked up a wrench and continued her work on the engine component. "It's a common expression among new arrivals. Usually fades after the first time they face actual combat conditions." Mercer felt his face flush with irritation. "I graduated top of my class at Fort Rucker, Sergeant. I've trained on the most advanced systems in the Army's arsenal." "Congratulations," Hayes replied without looking up. "Hand me that diagnostic tablet." Mercer passed her the ruggedized computer, watching as her grease-stained fingers deftly navigated through complex diagnostic screens. Despite his preconceptions, her technical knowledge was evident in the efficiency of her movements and the confidence with which she interpreted the data. "Your formal education is just the beginning," Hayes continued as she worked. "Out here, theory meets reality, and reality rarely follows the textbook." Throughout the morning, Mercer observed as Hayes completed the engine maintenance with methodical precision. Despite his initial judgment, he found himself impressed by her technical knowledge and practical solutions to problems that arose. She clearly understood the aircraft systems at a fundamental level that went beyond standard training. During a brief break, Mercer approached one of the senior mechanics, Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, who was calibrating navigation equipment nearby. "What's the deal with Sergeant Hayes?" he asked quietly. "She seems overqualified for routine maintenance on outdated equipment." Rodriguez gave him a measuring look. "You noticed that, did you? Maybe you're not as clueless as you look." He glanced around before continuing. "Hayes could have her pick of assignments anywhere in the Army Aviation Corps. She chooses to stay here. But why? That helicopter looks like it's held together with duct tape and prayers." Rodriguez chuckled. "Valkyrie might not look pretty, but that bird has saved more lives than any other helicopter in this theater. Hayes knows every inch of it, every quirk, every sound it makes. In a combat situation, that knowledge means everything." Before Mercer could inquire further, Sergeant Hayes called him back to assist with reassembling the engine housing. The rest of the day passed in a blur of maintenance tasks, system checks, and preparation for the next day's operations. Despite his initial skepticism, Mercer found himself challenged by the pace and complexity of the work. As evening approached, the daily briefing was called in the operations center. Mercer and the other new recruits filed into the crowded room, finding spaces along the back wall while senior personnel occupied the seats closer to the front. Colonel William Blackwood, the base commander, stood at the podium reviewing mission parameters for the following day's operations. Maps and tactical overlays were projected on screens behind him, showing multiple insertion points in mountainous terrain. The intelligence suggests increased insurgent activity in these 3 valleys. Blackwood explained, indicating areas on the map. "We'll be inserting reconnaissance teams here, and here to gather updated information before the main operation." Mercer noticed Sergeant Hayes sitting quietly near the front of the room, reviewing mission details on her tablet. Unlike many of the other pilots who discussed the briefing among themselves, she remained focused and solitary. "The insertion points present significant challenges," Colonel Blackwood continued. "High altitude, unpredictable wind patterns, and limited landing zones. Major Parker, what's your assessment of the approach vectors?" Major Parker, the aviation unit commander, stepped forward. "Sir, the southern approach offers the best combination of terrain masking and stable air currents, but it's still high risk. We'll meet our most experienced pilots on this one." Colonel Blackwood nodded. "Agreed. Assignment of pilots and aircraft will be your call, Major." As the briefing continued, Mercer found his attention repeatedly drawn to Sergeant Hayes. She seemed to be studying the terrain maps with particular intensity, occasionally making notes on her tablet. There was something in her focused concentration that contradicted his initial impression of her as just another maintenance specialist. After the briefing concluded, personnel began filing out of the operations center. Mercer overheard Major Parker speaking to Colonel Blackwood. "I want Hayes on the primary insertion," Parker was saying. "If anyone can get a team into that northern valley safely, it's her." "Are you sure?" Blackwood asked. "That's the most difficult approach. The terrain is brutal." "That's exactly why I want Hayes," Parker replied with conviction. "She's flown every valley in this region, knows the air currents better than anyone else on base." Mercer frowned in confusion. Why would they assign the most challenging mission to a pilot flying the oldest, most worn helicopter on base? It didn't make sense. Later that evening, as the recruits gathered in the mess hall for dinner, Mercer shared his observations with the others. "They're giving Sergeant Hayes the lead on tomorrow's insertion," he said, still puzzled by the decision. "Her helicopter looks like it's one hard landing away from the scrapyard, but they're sending her into the most difficult terrain." "Maybe there's more to her than you thought," Chun suggested, spearing a piece of mystery meat with her fork. "Lieutenant Foster seemed to respect her." "Even so," Mercer argued, "why not use one of the newer helicopters? The ones with updated avionics and better power-to-weight ratios? It just doesn't add up." Private Jackson, who had spent the day working with one of the weapons specialists, leaned forward. "I heard something interesting from Sergeant Miller today. Apparently, Hayes has flown more extraction missions under fire than any other pilot in Afghanistan. They call her the Ghost because she somehow gets in and out of hot zones that would be suicide for most pilots." Mercer raised an eyebrow. Skeptically. "If she's that good, why is she flying that beat-up old Black Hawk? Why isn't she with Special Operations or one of the elite units?" "Maybe you should ask her instead of questioning her behind her back," came a voice from behind them. The recruits turned to find Staff Sergeant Rodriguez standing there, his expression stern. "All due respect, Sergeant," Mercer said, recovering quickly. "We're just trying to understand the command structure here." Rodriguez set his tray down and joined them, his voice lowered. "Listen carefully, because I'm only going to say this once. Judge Sergeant Hayes or her aircraft at your own peril. There are reasons she flies that particular helicopter, and reasons. She's here at FOB Condor instead of somewhere with better accommodations and less risk. Those reasons are above your pay grade." The recruits exchanged glances, sensing there was much more to the story than Rodriguez was willing to share. "Tomorrow," Rodriguez continued, "some of you will be on maintenance duty when the birds return from their missions. Pay attention to which helicopters take fire and which ones don't. Notice which pilots bring their crews back without scratches and which ones don't. Then maybe you'll start to understand what experience means in a combat zone." With that, he stood and moved to another table, leaving the recruits to digest his words. Later that night, as Mercer prepared for bed in the cramped quarters assigned to new personnel, he found himself replaying the day's events in his mind. Despite his initial dismissal of Sergeant Hayes based on her aircraft's appearance, he had to admit that her technical knowledge was impressive. And the way senior officers deferred to her judgment about mission parameters suggested there was more to her story than was immediately apparent. He resolved to approach the next day with a more open mind. After all, he hadn't come to Afghanistan to reinforce his preconceptions. He'd come to learn and to serve. If Sergeant Hayes had knowledge to share, he would be foolish not to absorb as much of it as possible, regardless of his personal judgments about her or her aircraft. As he drifted toward sleep, the distant sound of helicopter rotors filled the night air. Somewhere in the darkness, operations continued, missions were executed, and lives hung in the balance. All realities that his training, however excellent, had not fully prepared him to face. Morning arrived with the muffled thunder of artillery in the distance, a stark reminder that FOB Condor existed in an active war zone. Mercer reported to the maintenance hangar at 0530 hours, surprised to find Sergeant Hayes already there, conducting pre-flight checks on her helicopter. "You're assigned to ground crew today," she informed him without preamble. "You'll monitor communications and coordinate with maintenance if we need emergency repairs upon return." "Yes, Sergeant," Mercer replied, noting the seriousness in her expression. Whatever mission she was preparing for, it clearly carried significant risk. Throughout the morning, helicopters departed in carefully coordinated intervals, carrying reconnaissance teams to their insertion points according to the previous day's briefing. Mercer watched from the operations center as mission controllers tracked each aircraft's progress, their voices remaining professional despite the tension that filled the room. 3 hours into the operation, the radio crackled with urgent communications. "Condor Base, this is Falcon 2. We're taking heavy fire at the northern insertion point. Unable to complete drop-off. Requesting immediate support. Over." Colonel Blackwood moved quickly to the communication station. "Falcon 2, this is Condor Actual. Report status and position. Taking damage to tail rotor. Multiple hostiles with heavy weapons on ridgelines. We're withdrawing to safe distance, but Team Delta is still on the ground. They need immediate extraction. Over." The operations center erupted into controlled chaos as officers assessed options and coordinated resources. Mercer watched as Major Parker consulted briefly with Colonel Blackwood, then made a decision. "Get Valkyrie in the air," Parker ordered. "Have Hayes proceed to the Northern Valley for emergency extraction." Mercer felt his stomach tighten. They were sending in the oldest helicopter on base to perform a high-risk extraction under enemy fire. It seemed like a recipe for disaster. "Sir," he said before he could stop himself, "Valkyrie is the oldest Black Hawk we have. Wouldn't one of the newer helicopters be better equipped for this situation?" The room fell silent as all eyes turned. To him, Major Parker's expression hardened. "Private Mercer, isn't it?" Parker said coldly. "When I want your tactical assessment, I'll request it. Until then, focus on your assigned duties." "Yes, sir. I apologize, sir." Colonel Blackwood gave Mercer a measuring look. "If you're concerned about Sergeant Hayes's aircraft, Private, perhaps you should join the ground crew monitoring her mission. It might prove educational." Minutes later, Mercer found himself in the Tactical Operations Center, watching his Valkyries. Identification beacon moved rapidly across digital maps toward the contested Northern Valley. The communications specialist beside him handed over a spare headset, allowing Mercer to listen to the mission communications. "Valkyrie approaching. Northern Corridor." Hayes's calm voice came through the headset. "Requesting last known positions of hostile forces in Team Delta." The intelligence officer provided coordinates, his voice tight with concern. "Be advised, Valkyrie, they have multiple heavy weapons positioned on both ridgelines. Falcon 2 took significant damage attempting insertion." "Understood," Hayes replied, her tone unchanged. "I'll approach from the eastern ravine. Lower altitude, better terrain masking." "That route isn't in the mission parameters," the officer responded. "It's too narrow for safe passage." "I'm familiar with it," Hayes said simply. "Valkyrie can handle it." Mercer exchanged glances with the communications specialist, who shrugged. "She knows what she's doing," the specialist murmured. "Just watch." For the next 20 minutes, Mercer observed in tense silence as Valkyrie's beacon progressed through terrain that the mission planners had designated as too dangerous for flight operations. According to the tactical display, Hayes was flying her helicopter through a narrow ravine, using the terrain to shield her approach from enemy positions. "This is Valkyrie." Hayes's voice broke the silence. "Visual contact with Team Delta. They're pinned down in a dry riverbed, taking fire from the northern ridge. I'm going in." "Be advised, Valkyrie," came the urgent response from command. "Satellite shows at least 12 hostiles with anti-aircraft weapons on that ridge." "Acknowledged," Hayes replied. "I see them." What happened next, Mercer could only follow through the communications and the shift in position indicators on the tactical display. Hayes apparently cut power and dropped Valkyrie into a controlled descent that brought her directly into the riverbed where Team Delta was trapped a maneuver that would have been challenging in the newest helicopter, let alone one as old as Valkyrie. "Delta, this is Valkyrie. I'm 30 seconds from your position. Prepare for immediate extraction. It's going to be hot." The next few minutes were a symphony of urgent communications, weapons fire, and the sound of Valkyrie's engine straining against the thin mountain air. Mercer found himself gripping the edge of the console, his earlier skepticism forgotten as he listened to Hayes calmly directing her gunners, advising the ground team, and executing a series of flight maneuvers that defied conventional tactics. "All friendlies aboard," Hayes reported, taking fire from multiple directions, beginning extraction. Instead of immediately gaining altitude, the standard procedure for extraction under fire, Hayes kept Valkyrie low, following the contours of the riverbed before making a sharp turn into an even narrower side canyon. "Valkyrie, you're headed into a dead end," the mission controller warned. "Satellite shows no viable exit from that position." "There's a way through," Hayes responded, her voice still impossibly calm. "Trust me." For nearly 2 minutes, Valkyrie's beacon seemed to disappear from the tracking system, causing a ripple of concern through the operations center. Then, suddenly, it reappeared on the far side of the mountain range, safely away from enemy positions. Valkyrie to Condor Base. Extraction complete. All members of Team Delta secure. Minor injuries only. Returning to base. ETA 22 minutes. A cheer erupted in the operations center, quickly suppressed by the senior officers who reminded everyone that other missions were still in progress. But Mercer had seen enough. Whatever his initial impressions of Sergeant Hayes and her aircraft, her actions had just saved the lives of an entire reconnaissance team in conditions that would have defeated most pilots. When Valkyrie landed back at FOB Condor, Mercer was among the ground crew that met the helicopter. The aircraft showed fresh damaged bullet holes, peppered its fuselage, and one of the side panels had been partially torn away, but it had completed its mission and returned. Hayes emerged from the cockpit, her flight suit stained with hydraulic fluid and what appeared to be blood. She spoke briefly with the medical team that took charge of the injured reconnaissance personnel, then turned her attention to her helicopter, running her hand along the damaged sections with what Mercer could only describe as affection. "Sergeant Hayes," he said, approaching cautiously. "That was impressive flying." She looked at him, her expression neutral. "Just doing the job, Private. The way you navigated that canyon system, it wasn't on any of our maps." "Not everything worth knowing is on a map," she replied. "Some knowledge only comes from experience." Before Mercer could respond, Major Parker approached, his earlier sternness replaced by open respect. "Outstanding work, Madison," he said. Dispensing with formal address. "That makes what now? 73 successful extractions under fire?" 74, Hayes corrected quietly. "But who's counting?" Parker laughed. "You're too modest. Always have been." He turned to Mercer. "I hope you were paying attention, Private. You just witnessed a masterclass in combat aviation." As Parker walked away, Mercer found himself reassessing everything he thought he knew about Sergeant Madison Hayes. 74 successful extractions under enemy fire was more than impressive. It was nearly impossible. Most combat pilots might perform a handful of such missions during their entire careers. "Sergeant," he began, struggling to find the right words, "I think I may have misjudged you and your helicopter." Hayes regarded him thoughtfully. "Valkyrie and I have been through a lot together. Sometimes the oldest tools are the most reliable, especially when you know exactly how they'll respond. In every situation." She patted the helicopter's scarred fuselage. "Now if you're done having revelations, we need to get her patched up for tomorrow's missions." As they worked on repairing Valkyrie's battle damage, Mercer noticed something he'd overlooked during his previous assessment of the helicopter. Near the pilot's door, partially obscured by years of repainting, was a row of small symbol-stylized tallies that had been carefully maintained despite the aircraft's numerous repairs. "What are those markings?" he asked, pointing to the symbols. Hayes glanced at where he was indicating, then returned to her work without answering. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, passing by with a replacement part, paused long enough to say, "Those are her confirmed saves. One mark for each verified life she's pulled out of impossible situations." He lowered his voice. "The unofficial count is over 300 now, but Hayes stopped updating it years ago. Said it was becoming too conspicuous. 300 lives saved. The number was staggering." Mercer looked at Hayes with new eyes, finally beginning to understand what everyone else on the base already knew. Beneath her quiet demeanor and unassuming appearance was one of the most accomplished combat pilots in the entire theater of operations. And he had dismissed her because her helicopter looked old. The next morning, the base buzzed with accounts of Sergeant Hayes's impossible extraction mission. As Mercer entered the mess hall for breakfast, he noticed how conversations quieted momentarily when Hayes walked in, followed by respectful nods from senior officers who rarely acknowledged enlisted personnel so openly. She accepted their recognition with quiet dignity, neither encouraging nor discouraging the attention. "Man, I still can't believe what she pulled off yesterday," Private Chun whispered as she slid her tray alongside Mercer's. "Jackson was in the Tactical Operations Center. Said she flew that old Black Hawk through gaps that shouldn't have been physically possible." Mercer nodded, watching as Hayes took a seat alone at the far end of the mess hall. "I was wrong about her," he admitted. "About everything." "You weren't the only one," Chun replied. "We all made assumptions based on that helicopter. Seems pretty stupid now." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Captain Eleanor Walsh, the base intelligence officer. Unlike most officers who maintained a careful distance from enlisted personnel, Walsh had a reputation for sharing information across rank boundaries when it served operational needs. "Morning, recruits," Walsh said, setting her coffee mug on their table. "Mind if I join you?" "Of course not, ma'am," Mercer responded, both he and Chun straightening instinctively. Walsh sat down, her expression thoughtful as she glanced toward Hayes. "I understand you're working with Sergeant Hayes on maintenance rotation, Private Mercer." "Yes, ma'am." "Since yesterday." "Good. Pay attention to everything she teaches you. It might save your life someday." Walsh sipped her coffee, then added more quietly, "What she did yesterday wasn't luck or a fluke. It was the result of experience most pilots never accumulate in their entire careers." Mercer hesitated, then asked the question that had been bothering him since the previous day. "Ma'am, if she's that good, why is she flying the oldest helicopter on base? Why isn't she with Special Operations or an elite unit?" Walsh studied him for a moment, seemingly weighing how much to reveal. "Who says she wasn't?" Before Mercer could press for clarification, alarms blared across the base. The mess hall emptied in seconds as personnel rushed to their stations. Captain Walsh was already moving toward the command center, leaving Mercer's question unanswered. "All flight crews report for immediate briefing," came the announcement over the base-wide communication system. "Repeat, all flight crews to Operations Center now." Mercer and Chun exchanged glances before hurrying toward the Operations Center. Although they weren't flight crew, their maintenance responsibilities made them peripheral to any major aviation operation. The Operations Center was packed with personnel when they arrived. Colonel Blackwood stood at the central display, his expression grave as he addressed the assembled teams. "At 0540 this morning, one of our long-range patrols was ambushed in the Kringle Valley," Blackwood announced, indicating a location on the tactical map. "They've taken casualties and are now surrounded by hostile forces estimated at 3 times their number. Terrain prevents them from reaching a suitable extraction point." The room filled with murmurs as personnel assessed the implications. The Kringle Valley was notorious for its difficult terrain and concentrated insurgent activity. Multiple American units had suffered heavy casualties there over the years. "We have a narrow window to extract our people before the enemy receives reinforcements," Blackwood continued. "Major Parker will coordinate the aviation element of this rescue operation." Parker stepped forward, his normally confident demeanor tempered by the gravity of the situation. "We'll need 3 helicopters for the extraction. 2 will provide cover while the 3rd goes in for the pickup." He surveyed the room, his gaze settling on specific pilots. "Mitchell, Ramirez, you'll fly escort. Hayes, your primary extraction." Mercer watched as Sergeant Hayes acknowledged the assignment with a simple nod. Around her, other pilots shifted uncomfortably, well aware of the extreme danger the mission presented. "Sir," one of the senior pilots spoke up, "the weather reports indicate heavy cloud cover and potential thunderstorms in that region. Visibility will be severely limited." "I'm aware, Captain," Parker replied. "That's precisely why Sergeant Hayes is taking point on this one. She knows that valley better than anyone else on this base, and Valkyrie has pulled off extractions in worse conditions. As the briefing continued with specific tactical details, Mercer found himself watching Hayes. While other personnel displayed varying degrees of tension, she remained calm, studying the terrain maps and making occasional notes on her tablet. There was something almost methodical about her preparation, as if she were approaching a particularly challenging maintenance problem rather than a life-or-death combat mission. After the briefing, personnel dispersed to prepare for the operation. Mercer was assigned to Hayes's pre-flight team, responsible for ensuring Valkyrie was mission-ready despite the damage it had sustained the previous day. In the maintenance hangar, Hayes was already inspecting her helicopter, checking each repair with meticulous attention. "How can I help, Sergeant?" Mercer asked, approaching cautiously. Hayes glanced up. "Run a complete diagnostic on the avionics system. I need to know if yesterday's damage affected any of the navigation components." As Mercer connected the diagnostic equipment, he found himself wanting to ask a dozen questions about Hayes's background, her experience, and her seemingly supernatural ability to fly into situations that other pilots deemed impossible. But her focused concentration discouraged casual conversation. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez joined them, carrying a replacement communications panel. "How's she looking, Madison?" "She fly," Hayes replied with quiet confidence. "Hydraulic pressure is slightly below optimal on the starboard side, but within acceptable parameters." Rodriguez nodded, then turned to Mercer. "Make yourself useful and help me install this CUM system." As they worked together, Mercer finally found an opportunity to ask the questions that had been burning in his mind. "Sergeant Rodriguez, what's the real story with Hayes?" Captain Walsh hinted that she might have been with Special Operations. Rodriguez's hands paused momentarily before continuing with the installation. "It's not my story to tell, kid. But I'll say this: before Hayes came to regular Army aviation, she flew missions that don't appear in any official record. The kind of operations where success means nobody ever knows what happened, and failure means you don't come back at all. Then why is she here now, flying an old Black Hawk at a forward operating base? That's the part you don't understand yet," Rodriguez said, tightening a connection with more force than necessary. "She's not here because she has to be. She's here because she chooses to be." Before Mercer could press further, Hayes approached to inspect their work. "Time to suit up," she said. "We launch in 30 minutes. As Mercer helped with the final preparations, he noticed something he'd overlooked before. Among the various patches and repairs on Valkyrie's fuselage was a small, faded insignia, a skull wearing a flight helmet, with the words "Night Stalkers" barely visible beneath it. The significance hit him like a physical blow. The 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment, the Night Stalkers, was the Army's elite helicopter unit, responsible for inserting and extracting Special Forces teams from the most dangerous environments. On Earth, their motto, "Night Stalkers Don't Quit," was legendary throughout the military. Hayes had been a Night Stalker. Not just any pilot, but a member of the most selective, highly trained aviation unit in the entire Army. And now she was flying an aging Black Hawk at a forward operating base in Afghanistan, taking on missions that other pilots couldn't handle. None of it made sense. Mercer was still processing this revelation when the call came to launch. He watched from the ground as Valkyrie lifted off, accompanied by two newer, more heavily armed Black Hawks. The three helicopters disappeared into the cloudy sky, heading toward a mission that everyone on base knew carried extreme risk. In the Tactical Operations Center, Mercer joined other ground personnel monitoring the mission's progress. The atmosphere was tense as communications specialists tracked the helicopter's movements and relayed updates. "Extraction team is 20 minutes from target area," announced the mission controller. "Weather deteriorating rapidly. Visibility down to less than half a mile in some sectors." Colonel Blackwood stood behind the controllers, his face etched with concern. "Maintain continuous communication." I want to know the moment they make contact with our ground team. For the next 15 minutes, routine position updates came through as the helicopters approached the Korangal Valley. Then, suddenly, the calm professionalism of the control room was shattered. "Taking fire," came the urgent voice of Captain Mitchell. "Heavy weapons on the southern ridgeline. My port engine is hit." "Mitchell, break right and gain altitude," Major Parker ordered from his position in the control center. "Ramirez, provide." "Covering fire." "Hayes, what's your status?" "Continuing approach," Hayes replied, her voice unnervingly calm amid the chaos. "I've located the ground team. They're in a narrow ravine 2 clicks from their last reported position." "That's too hot for insertion," Parker warned. "Mitchell is taking heavy damage. Ramirez can't suppress all those firing positions alone." "I'm not using the main approach," Hayes responded. "There's a narrow gap in the eastern ridgeline. It's not on the maps, but I've used it before." "Negative, Hayes," Colonel Blackwood cut in. "Visibility is too poor for off-map navigation. Abort and reassess." There was a brief pause before Hayes's voice came through again. "With respect, sir, if we abort now, that ground team won't survive until a second attempt. I can get to them." The operations center fell silent as Colonel Blackwood considered the situation. Finally, he spoke. "Proceed at your discretion." "Sergeant Hayes, but if conditions worsen, I expect you to pull out immediately." "Understood, sir." For the next several minutes, the operations center received only intermittent communications as the 3 helicopters navigated the dangerous airspace. Captain Mitchell's Black Hawk was forced to withdraw due to engine damage, while Ramirez continued to provide what covering fire he could, despite the deteriorating weather conditions. Then, through the static and interference, came Hayes's voice. "Visual contact with ground team, moving in for extraction." What followed was a series of terse communications that painted a picture of extraordinary flying under impossible conditions. Hayes had apparently navigated Valkyrie through a gap in the ridgeline that wasn't documented on any map, descending into a ravine barely wider than her rotor span to reach the stranded patrol. 7 wounded on board, Hayes reported. "All personnel accounted for. Beginning extraction." "Weather's getting worse," Ramirez warned. "I've lost visual contact with you, Hayes. Cloud ceiling is dropping fast." "Maintain your position, Ramirez," Hayes instructed. "I'll find my own way out." For an agonizing 13 minutes, Valkyrie disappeared from both radar tracking and communication. In the operations center, tension mounted as repeated attempts to establish contact failed. Could she have gone down? Someone whispered. Colonel Blackwood's expression remained stoic, but Mercer noticed his knuckles whitening as he gripped the back of a chair. Then, breaking through the static, Valkyrie to base. Extraction complete. All personnel secure. Returning via northern corridor, ETA 25 minutes. The relief in the operations center was palpable. Personnel exchanged glances that combined disbelief with renewed respect. Whatever Hayes had done to navigate out of that valley with a fully loaded helicopter in deteriorating weather conditions, it defied conventional aviation tactics. When the helicopters returned to base, Mercer was among the ground crew that met them. Ramirez's Black Hawk showed minor damage from enemy fire, while Mitchell's aircraft was already in the maintenance hangar, undergoing emergency repairs to its damaged engine. Valkyrie, however, bore the unmistakable signs of a mission that had pushed aircraft and pilot to their absolute limits. New bullet holes peppered its fuselage. One of the main rotor blades showed impact damage, and hydraulic fluid leaked from multiple points in the undercarriage. Medical teams rushed forward to attend to the wounded as the helicopter's doors opened. Among them was a sergeant from the rescued patrol, his uniform torn and bloodied, but his eyes alert as he was helped toward a waiting ambulance. "That pilot," the sergeant said, gripping the arm of a medic. "I need to thank that pilot. Hayes emerged from the cockpit last, her flight suit soaked with perspiration and streaked with what appeared to be soot. She moved immediately to check on the wounded before turning her attention to her helicopter. The rescued sergeant saw her and broke away from the medics, staggering toward Hayes with determination. "Sergeant Hayes," he called, his voice rough with emotion. "You pulled us out of hell back there." Hayes turned, acknowledging him with a nod. "Just doing my job, Sergeant." "No," the man insisted, reaching her and extending his hand. "What you did, that wasn't just a job. There wasn't a pilot in the Army who could have reached us in that ravine. My men would be dead if not for you." Hayes shook his hand briefly. "Your men fought hard to stay alive until we could reach you. That's what matters." The sergeant nodded, understanding that Hayes wasn't comfortable with explicit gratitude. "The Night Stalkers still live up to their reputation," he said quietly, before allowing the medics to lead him away. Mercer, who had been close enough to overhear the exchange, watched as Hayes returned to inspecting Valkyrie's damage. The confirmation of her Night Stalker background only deepened the mystery surrounding her current assignment. Later that evening, as the base settled into its nighttime routine and the day's events became the subject of hushed conversations, Mercer found himself outside the maintenance hangar. Through the open doors, he could see Hayes working alone on Valkyrie, methodically assessing and beginning repairs on the damage sustained during the mission. "You should be resting," came a voice from behind him. Mercer turned to find Captain Walsh approaching, a tablet tucked under her arm. "Just wanted to check on the helicopter, ma'am," Mercer replied. The damage seemed extensive. Walsh studied him for a moment. "You've got questions about Hayes." "It wasn't a question, but—" Mercer nodded anyway. "Yes, ma'am. Nothing makes sense. She's clearly one of the best pilots in the entire Army. She was with the 160th SOAR, and yet she's here flying the oldest helicopter on base, taking on missions that should be impossible." Walsh glanced toward the hangar where Hayes continued her solitary work. "Sometimes, Private Mercer, the most extraordinary people are the ones who choose to serve quietly, without recognition or acclaim." She paused, seemingly considering how much to reveal. "Did you notice the date on Valkyrie's service record?" "No, ma'am." "That helicopter has been in continuous service for over 20 years. It was scheduled for decommissioning 5 years ago, but Hayes specifically requested it remain active under her command." "But why?" "It's outdated, requires constant maintenance, lacks the advanced systems of newer models." "Because," Walsh said quietly, "Valkyrie was her helicopter during her time with the Night Stalkers. They've been through more together than most marriages survive." The revelation struck Mercer with unexpected force. The connection between pilot and aircraft wasn't merely professional, it was personal, forged through countless dangerous missions and shared survival. "There's more to it than that," Walsh continued, her voice dropping further. "But it's not my story to tell. If you want to understand Hayes, really understand her, you might start by asking about the missions that aren't in her official record. The ones that earned Valkyrie those kill marks that no one talks about." With that cryptic suggestion, Walsh departed, leaving Mercer with more questions than answers. He remained outside the hangar for several minutes, watching as Hayes worked on her helicopter with the same focused attention she brought to her flying. Finally, gathering his courage, Mercer entered the hangar. Hayes looked up briefly as he approached, then returned to her task of replacing a damaged hydraulic line. "Need something, Private?" she asked without pausing in her work. "I thought you might need assistance, Sergeant," Mercer replied, careful to maintain a respectful tone despite his burning curiosity. Hayes considered him for a moment. "Hand me that torque wrench." For the next hour, they worked together in relative silence, Mercer providing tools and assistance as Hayes methodically addressed the most critical damage to Valkyrie. Despite the lateness of the hour and the physical demands of the day's mission, her movements remained precise and efficient. As they completed the temporary repairs to the hydraulic system, Mercer finally found the courage to voice the question that had been troubling him since learning of Hayes's background. "Sergeant, may I ask you something?" Hayes wiped her hands. On a rag, her expression neutral. "Go ahead." "I know you were with the Night Stalkers," Mercer said carefully. "What I don't understand is why you're here now, flying missions in an aircraft that should have been retired years ago, when you could be with any elite unit in the Army." Hayes was quiet for so long that Mercer thought she might not answer. Then, unexpectedly, she moved toward the front of the helicopter and gestured for him to follow. "Look at this," she said, pointing to the row of small symbols Mercer had noticed earlier, the markings that Staff Sergeant Rodriguez had called confirmed saves. "These represent lives," Hayes explained, her voice taking on a quality Mercer hadn't heard before, something deeper, weighted with memory. "Each mark is someone who would have died if we hadn't reached them in time. There must be hundreds," Mercer observed. 327, Hayes confirmed. "At least that's when I stopped counting." She ran her hand along Valkyrie's scarred fuselage. "This helicopter and I have pulled people out of situations that were classified as unsurvivable. We've flown missions that violated every principle of safe aviation. We've taken damage that should have brought us down a dozen times over." She turned to face Mercer directly. "You want to know why I'm here instead of flying the newest helicopters with special operations? It's because some bonds go beyond logic or career advancement. Valkyrie knows my touch, responds to my instincts in ways a new aircraft never could. That saved lives today, just like it has hundreds of times before." Mercer nodded slowly, beginning to understand. "The helicopter isn't just a machine to you. No more than a rifle is just a tool to an experienced soldier," Hayes replied. "When your life and the lives of others depends on something, you develop a connection that goes beyond the mechanical." She fell silent, and Mercer sensed there was more to the story, perhaps much more, but he had already been granted a rare glimpse into Hayes's thinking. He wouldn't push for more, at least not tonight. "Thank you, Sergeant," he said simply, "for the explanation and for what you did today." Hayes nodded once, then returned to her work, the conversation clearly concluded. But as Mercer left the hangar, he felt he had gained something valuable, not just insight into an exceptional pilot, but a new perspective on what it meant to serve with true dedication. The rescued patrol sergeant had been right. What Hayes did wasn't just a job. It was something far more profound, a calling that transcended the ordinary boundaries of military service. And somehow, against all odds, an ancient helicopter named Valkyrie was central to that calling. The next morning's briefing brought unexpected news that sent ripples of excitement through Phobe Condor. Colonel Blackwood announced that Lieutenant General Rebecca Harris, the regional combat commander, would be conducting an inspection tour of forward operating bases in the area, with Condor scheduled as her first stop. "General Harris will arrive tomorrow at 0900 hours, Blackwood informed the assembled personnel. "All stations will be subject to inspection. I expect every department to represent the highest standards of readiness and professionalism." As the briefing concluded, Mercer noticed a subtle shift in the atmosphere. Senior officers huddled in small groups, discussing preparation priorities, while enlisted personnel exchanged nervous glances. A visit from a 3-star general was rare enough to be significant, particularly at a forward operating base with active combat operations. "This is going to be intense," Chun commented as they walked toward the maintenance hangar. "My last unit spent 3 weeks preparing for a general's visit, and that was stateside." "We've got 1 day," Mercer replied. "And we're coming off 2 major extraction operations." In the maintenance hangar, the mood was focused but calm. Unlike other departments that scrambled to create a favorable impression, the Aviation Maintenance Division simply accelerated their normal repair schedules, prioritizing operational readiness over cosmetic improvements. Sergeant Hayes was already at work when Mercer arrived, supervising repairs to Valkyrie's battle. Damage from the previous day's mission. The helicopter's access panels were open, exposing complex systems that technicians methodically inspected and repaired. General's visit won't change our priorities, Hayes told the maintenance team. Operational aircraft take precedence over appearance. Focus on getting these birds ready to fly, not ready for show. Throughout the day, Mercer worked alongside the other engineers, addressing the damage to Valkyrie's hydraulic systems and structural components. Despite the pressure of the impending inspection, Hayes maintained the same methodical approach that characterized all her work, refusing to cut corners even for a general's visit. During a brief break, Mercer found himself standing next to Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, watching as Hayes troubleshot a particularly complex electrical issue in Valkyrie's avionics system. She's not even slightly nervous about the general's inspection. Mercer observed quietly. Rodriguez chuckled. Hayes has a different perspective on what matters. When you've flown the missions she has, a general's opinion about whether your helicopter looks pretty seems pretty insignificant. Still, General Harris is a big deal. 3 stars, combat commander for the entire region. True enough, Rodriguez acknowledged. But there's something you should understand about Hayes. She respects the chain of command, but she judges people by their actions, not their rank. Always has. As evening approached, most of the base continued frantic preparations for the general's arrival. The maintenance hangar, however, maintained its steady rhythm of repair and preparation. Hayes remained focused on ensuring Valkyrie would be flight-ready, regardless of whether it met the cosmetic standards typically expected for a high-level inspection. The next morning, FOB Condor transformed into a showcase of military precision. Personnel in immaculate uniforms stood at attention as General Harris's helicopter approached, its distinctive markings identifying it as a command transport. Mercer stood with the other maintenance personnel, watching as the sleek, modern helicopter touched down with practiced precision. The contrast with Valkyrie couldn't have been more striking, where Hayes's aircraft bore the scars of countless combat missions. The general's transport gleamed with polished surfaces and pristine paint. General Harris emerged from the helicopter, a tall woman in her late 50s with close-cropped gray hair and the unmistakable bearing of someone accustomed to command. Colonel Blackwood met her at the landing zone, rendering a crisp salute that the general returned with equal precision. The inspection began immediately, with General Harris and her staff moving methodically through the base, reviewing operations, questioning personnel, and assessing readiness levels. From his position in the maintenance hangar, Mercer could track their progress as they moved from the command center toward the aviation facilities. "Stand by," Lieutenant Foster instructed the maintenance team. General's party approaching. Hayes continued working on Valkyrie's electrical system, seemingly unconcerned by the impending inspection. Only when the general's entourage entered the hangar did she set aside her tools and stand at attention with the rest of the personnel. Colonel Blackwood led General Harris through the facility, highlighting the maintenance division's efficiency despite challenging conditions. The general listened attentively, occasionally asking pointed questions about readiness rates and operational capacity. When they reached Valkyrie, Hayes stood beside her helicopter, her posture military correct, but her expression unchanged from her normal calm focus. "And this is Sergeant Madison Hayes," Colonel Blackwood introduced, "one of our most experienced pilots and maintenance specialists." General Harris's eyes widened almost imperceptibly as she looked from Hayes to the battle-scarred helicopter. For a brief moment, something passed between the two women, a flash of recognition that Mercer couldn't interpret, but definitely noticed. "Sergeant Hayes," the general acknowledged, her tone carefully neutral. "This aircraft has seen considerable action." "Yes, ma'am," Hayes replied. "Valkyrie has been operational in theater for over 7 years. General Harris studied the helicopter more closely, her gaze lingering on the faded markings near the cockpit door. The kill count that. Recorded lives saved rather than enemies defeated. Remarkable longevity for a forward-deployed aircraft, she observed. Your maintenance protocols must be exceptional. We focus on critical systems integrity, ma'am, Hayes explained. Appearance is secondary to operational reliability. The general nodded, then asked unexpectedly, "How many extraction missions has this aircraft completed under your command, Sergeant?" 217 confirmed extractions under enemy fire, ma'am. 327 total. Life-saving missions. The hangar fell silent as personnel processed these numbers. Even Colonel Blackwood seemed surprised by the precise accounting. General Harris's expression remained professional, but Mercer detected a subtle shift in her demeanor, a new respect that hadn't been present moments before. "I'd like to speak with Sergeant Hayes privately," the general announced. "Colonel, please continue the inspection with your staff. I'll rejoin you shortly." "Of course, General," Blackwood replied, though his expression betrayed momentary confusion. As the inspection party moved on to the next station, General Harris turned to Hayes. "Walk with me, Sergeant." The two women moved toward the far end of the hangar, their conversation inaudible to the rest of the personnel. Mercer watched curiously as they spoke, noting the general's increasingly animated gestures contrasted with Hayes's characteristic calm. "What's that about?" Chun whispered, sliding up beside Mercer. "No idea," he replied. "But something tells me there's more to their connection than a random inspection." After several minutes, General Harris and Hayes returned to Valkyrie. The general's expression had changed. There was a new intensity in her gaze as she studied the helicopter more carefully. "I understand you've declined multiple opportunities for reassignment, Sergeant Hayes," General Harris said, her voice now carrying clearly to those nearby, "including a direct offer to join my headquarters staff as aviation consultant." "Yes, ma'am," Hayes confirmed. "My skills are best utilized here, in active operations." The general nodded thoughtfully. "That's becoming increasingly clear." She turned to address the maintenance personnel gathered nearby. "You should know that you're working with one of the finest combat pilots in the United States Army. The missions Sergeant Hayes has completed in this aircraft would fill a classified file thicker than your technical manuals." The revelation sent a ripple of surprise through the assembled engineers. Though Hayes's reputation had grown through recent missions, hearing such direct praise from a three-star general lent it new weight. "Carry on with your duties," General Harris concluded, before rejoining Colonel Blackwood's inspection party. As work resumed in the hangar, Mercer noticed a subtle change in how the other engineers interacted with Hayes. The respect had always been there, but now there was something else, a newfound appreciation for the quiet pilot who had never broadcasted her accomplishments. Later that afternoon, as General Harris prepared to depart, an urgent call came through to the operations center. A special forces team operating deep in insurgent territory had been compromised and needed immediate extraction. Their position was surrounded, with hostile forces closing in from multiple directions. Colonel Blackwood rushed to the communications station, quickly assessing the situation. "How many personnel need extraction?" 16 members, sir." Communications officer reported. 2 wounded. They're in a narrow valley with steep ridgelines on 3 sides. Heavy weapons reported on all surrounding high ground. Weather conditions? Deteriorating rapidly, sir. Dust storm approaching. From the west. Visibility will be minimal within the hour. Blackwood's expression darkened. "That's a nearly impossible extraction point, especially with a storm incoming." "Sir," Major Parker interjected, "we need to launch immediately if there's any chance of reaching them before conditions worsen." "Agreed. Assemble your best pilots." You'll need Hayes," General Harris interrupted, having approached the tactical display during the exchange. "And you'll need that old Black Hawk." of hers. All eyes turned to the general, who studied the terrain map with practiced assessment. "With respect, General," Colonel Blackwood began, "this is an extremely high-risk extraction. Perhaps we should deploy multiple aircraft with our newest systems." "Colonel," General Harris replied firmly, "I've seen Sergeant Hayes extract teams from worse situations than this. If anyone can reach those men, it's her." She pointed to the tactical display. "This valley has features similar to an operation Hayes conducted 3 years ago, an operation that remains classified, but resulted in the successful extraction of an entire, compromised intelligence unit under comparable conditions. The operations center fell silent as personnel processed this information." General Harris was not only endorsing Hayes for the mission, but revealing that she had personal knowledge of Hayes's classified operational history. "Very well, General," Blackwood conceded. "We'll deploy Sergeant Hayes as primary extraction, with 2 support helicopters providing cover." Within minutes, Hayes was briefed on the situation. She studied the tactical maps briefly, then nodded her understanding of the mission parameters. "I'll need 20 minutes to complete Valkyrie's hydraulic repairs," she said. "Then we can launch." "You have 15, General Harris responded. "I'll authorize any additional resources you require." As Hayes departed to prepare her helicopter, Mercer found himself reassigned to her pre-flight team on direct orders from General Harris. The general herself moved to the Tactical Operations Center to monitor the mission, her departure from the base apparently postponed indefinitely. In the maintenance hangar, Hayes worked with focused intensity, directing engineers to complete critical repairs while she performed a thorough pre-flight inspection. Despite the abbreviated timeframe, she refused to skip safety protocols or overlook potential issues. "Hydraulic pressure restored to optimal levels," Mercer reported as he completed the final system check. "All flight controls responding normally." Hayes nodded her acknowledgement. "Fuel status?" "Tanks topped off, ma'am. You've got maximum range plus emergency reserve." As the pre-flight checks concluded, Mercer found himself face-to-face with Hayes beside Valkyrie's open door. For a brief moment, he thought he detected something new in her expression, not fear, but perhaps a heightened awareness of the mission's extreme difficulty. "Sergeant," he said impulsively, "what General Harris said about you, about your previous operations, is it true?" Hayes regarded him steadily. "What matters isn't what I've done before, Private. What matters is what needs to be done now." She gestured toward the tactical map she'd been studying. 6 men are out there, surrounded and running out of time. They need someone to reach them when conventional wisdom says it can't be done. And you can do it? Mercer asked, already knowing the answer but needing to hear it confirmed. "Valkyrie and I can do it," Hayes corrected, placing her hand on the helicopter's scarred fuselage. "We've faced worse odds and brought everyone home." With that, she climbed into the cockpit, her movements smooth and practiced. The Black Hawk's engines roared to life, rotors beginning their characteristic acceleration toward flight speed. Mercer stepped back, joining the ground crew at a safe distance as Valkyrie lifted off, accompanied by 2 escort helicopters. The 3 aircraft banked sharply, heading toward the distant mountains where 6 soldiers waited in desperate hope of rescue. In the Tactical Operations Center, Mercer joined other personnel monitoring the mission's progress. General Harris stood behind the communications officers, her attention fixed on the tactical display that tracked the helicopter's movements. "Extraction team is 15 minutes from target area," reported the mission controller. "Dust storm. Front is advancing faster than predicted. Visibility dropping rapidly. Maintain communication as long as possible," Colonel Blackwood ordered. "I want continuous updates." For several minutes, routine position reports came through as the helicopters approached the extraction zone. Then, as they entered the storm's periphery, communications became increasingly fragmented. Taking fire from the northern ridge came the broken transmission from one of the escort pilots. Visibility down to less than a quarter mile and deteriorating. Continue approach, Hayes' calm voice responded. Maintain current heading. That's suicide, someone muttered in the operations center. They can't see the terrain, let alone the enemy positions. General Harris remained silent, her expression revealing nothing of her thoughts as she watched the tactical display. Suddenly, one of the escort helicopter's indicators began flashing on the screen. Eagle 2 taking damage, came the urgent report. Multiple impacts. Hydraulic system compromised. Return to base, Eagle 2, Colonel Blackwood ordered immediately. You're no good to the mission if you go down. As the damaged helicopter turned back, Hayes' voice came through the static. Eagle 1, maintain position at the valley entrance. Provide covering fire, but do not attempt to follow me in. I'll handle the extraction alone. Negative, Valkyrie, Major Parker countered from the operations center. Conditions are deteriorating too rapidly. We need to abort and attempt extraction. When the storm clears. There was a pause filled only with static before Hayes responded. Those men won't survive that long, sir. I'm continuing the approach. Colonel Blackwood looked to General Harris, clearly expecting her to override Hayes' decision. Instead, the general simply nodded once. Let her proceed, Colonel. She knows what she's doing. For the next 17 minutes, communications with Valkyrie became increasingly sporadic as the helicopter disappeared into the heart of the dust storm. Occasional transmissions broke through the interference, painting a fragmented picture of an aircraft navigating by instinct and experience when conventional visibility failed completely. Using terrain echo for navigation, Hayes reported at one point, her voice barely audible through the static. Valley walls approximately 50 meters on either side. That's impossible, the operations officer whispered. No one can navigate that precisely using sound echoes in a dust storm. She can, General Harris stated with quiet certainty. Minutes later, Hayes' voice broke through again. Visual contact with ground team. Beginning descent into extraction zone. The operations center fell silent as personnel strained to hear the fragmentary communications. Reports of heavy enemy fire mixed with updates on the team's loading process, creating a tense narrative of a rescue operation conducted at the absolute limits of what was possible. All personnel aboard, came Hayes' transmission. 6 passengers. 2 critical, 4 ambulatory. Beginning extraction. Return vector compromised, warned the remaining escort pilot. Multiple hostiles with heavy weapons on the southern ridge. You can't go back the way you came in. There was no immediate response from Hayes. On the tactical display, Valkyrie's indicator showed the helicopter hovering in the extraction zone, seemingly trapped by surrounding enemy positions and the advancing dust storm. Valkyrie, report. Status, Colonel Blackwood demanded. After an agonizing delay, Hayes' voice returned, calm despite the dire circumstances, plotting alternative extraction route. There's a narrow ravine on the eastern side that might provide enough clearance for rotor passage. That's not on any of our maps, the intelligence officer protested. The eastern face is a sheer cliff according to satellite imagery. The maps are incomplete, Hayes replied simply. Trust me. For the next 22 minutes, Valkyrie disappeared completely from both radar tracking and communication. In the operations center, tension mounted as repeated attempts to establish contact failed. Even General Harris showed signs of concern, her normally impassive expression giving way to a slight furrow between her brows. Should we deploy search and rescue? Colonel Blackwood asked quietly. Not yet, General Harris replied. Give her time. Just as the colonel seemed ready to override the general's patience, the radio crackled to life. Valkyrie to base. Extraction complete. All personnel secure. Emerging from Stormfront Eastern Sector. ETA 20 minutes. The relief in the operations center was electric. Personnel exchanged looks of disbelief. mixed with renewed respect for what Hayes had accomplished. Even General Harris allowed herself a small smile of satisfaction. When Valkyrie landed at FOB Condor, medical teams rushed forward to attend to the wounded Special Forces operators. The helicopter showed fresh battle-damaged bullet holes across its fuselage, a cracked windscreen, and rotor blades abraded by the dust storm's fury. Hayes emerged from the cockpit last, her flight suit covered in fine dust that had penetrated every seam of the aircraft during the storm. Her expression remained composed as she completed her shutdown checklist before joining the ground crew. General Harris was waiting beside the helicopter, her staff maintaining a respectful distance. As she approached Hayes, "Still flying into the impossible, I see," the general said, her formal demeanor softening slightly. "Just doing what needed to be done, ma'am," Hayes replied. "That ravine on the eastern face isn't on any of our maps," General Harris observed. "How did you know it was there?" "I flew a night insertion through that valley 3 years ago," Hayes explained. "The geological features haven't changed, even if the maps haven't caught up." The general nodded thoughtfully. "My offer still stands, you know. A position on my staff would save a lot of lives through the training programs you could develop." "With respect, General, I save lives directly out here," Hayes replied, gesturing toward Valkyrie. "This is where I belong." General Harris studied her for a moment, then nodded in acceptance. "Your choice has always been clear, Madison, even when others questioned it." She extended her hand. "The Army needs more people like you people, who understand that sometimes the most valuable service happens without recognition or advancement." As Hayes shook the general's hand, Mercer watched from nearby, finally beginning to understand the deeper story behind the quiet pilot in her ancient helicopter. There was clearly a history between Hayes and General Harris that went beyond normal military relationships, perhaps a shared past in operations too classified to discuss openly. Later that evening, as General Harris prepared once more to depart, she sought out Mercer near the maintenance hangar where he was helping with Valkyrie's post-mission inspection. "Private Mercer," the general said, approaching with purposeful strides. "A word, if you please." "Yes, ma'am," Mercer responded, immediately coming to attention. "At ease." General Harris studied him with an evaluative gaze. "I understand. You've been working closely with Sergeant Hayes since your arrival at FOB Condor." "Yes, ma'am, for the past few days." "And what have you learned from her?" The question caught Mercer by surprise. It seemed unusually personal, coming from a 3-star general to a private first class. "I've learned that appearances can be deceiving, ma'am," he answered carefully. "That sometimes the most extraordinary capabilities come in packages we don't initially recognize or respect." General Harris nodded, a hint of approval in her expression. "A valuable lesson." "Anything else?" Mercer considered before responding. "I've learned that true excellence doesn't require recognition to be valid. That some people serve not for advancement or acclaim, but because the work itself matters." "You're observant, Private," the general commented. "Those are lessons many officers never fully grasp, even after decades of service." She glanced toward the hangar where Hayes continued to work on Valkyrie. "You might be interested to know that 10 years ago, Sergeant Hayes was on track to become one of the youngest helicopter battalion commanders in Army history." "What happened?" Mercer asked before remembering to add, "If you don't mind me asking, ma'am." "What happened was a choice," General Harris replied. "A mission went bad, details still classified, and Hayes made a decision that saved 37 lives at great personal cost. Afterward, when offered command positions, medals, promotions, she declined them all. Requested assignment to operational roles instead, where she could continue flying direct missions rather than managing those who did. She chose the work over the recognition," Mercer said, understanding dawning. "Precisely. Many questioned that decision, including me at the time. But watching her operate over the years, I've come to understand it. The general's gaze returned to Mercer. "Remember what you've seen here, Private. In a military culture that often equates success with rank advancement, Hayes represents something different, but equally valuable: the dedication to serve where one's skills make the most direct difference, regardless of recognition." With that, General Harris departed, leaving Mercer with a new perspective on Hayes's choices and her unusual position at FOB Condor. The mystery wasn't why a pilot of her exceptional abilities was flying an aging helicopter at a forward operating base. The mystery was why more people didn't understand the value of what she was doing. As Mercer returned to helping with Valkyrie's repairs, he found himself viewing both the helicopter and its pilot with deepened respect. The battle scars that had once seemed like signs of obsolescence now told a story of survival against impossible odds. The faded paint and patched panels weren't evidence of neglect, but badges of honor, earned in the most demanding conditions imaginable. And Madison Hayes, the quiet pilot who let her actions speak louder than any words, had become something unexpected in Mercer's military journey, a model of service that transcended conventional measures of success. 3 weeks after General Harris's visit, FOB Condor had settled into a new rhythm. The general's explicit recognition of Hayes's abilities had shifted perceptions throughout the base. Senior officers now routinely consulted her on mission planning, particularly for operations in difficult terrain. Maintenance schedules were adjusted to ensure Valkyrie received priority attention, despite its age and apparent obsolescence. For Mercer, these weeks had transformed his understanding of military service. His daily work with Hayes provided technical knowledge far beyond standard training, but more importantly, it offered insights into a philosophy of service defined by impact rather than recognition. One morning, as Mercer assisted with Valkyrie's routine maintenance, Major Parker entered the hangar, his expression serious. "Sergeant Hayes," Parker called, approaching with purposeful strides. "We've got a situation developing that requires your expertise." Hayes looked up from the engine component she was inspecting. "What kind of situation, sir?" "Intelligence reports a high-value target meeting in a compound near the Pakistan border. Special Operations wants to insert a capture team, but the location is problematic." Parker unfolded a terrain map across a nearby workbench. The compound sits in a narrow valley with only one apparent approach vector, heavily monitored by lookouts. Hayes studied the map, her experienced eyes quickly assessing the challenges. "What's the time frame?" "Meeting is confirmed for tomorrow night. We'd need to insert the team before sunset and extract after the operation, likely under fire." "Weather conditions?" "Clear skies predicted, almost full moon. Double-edged sword, good visibility for us, but also for any hostiles watching the approaches." Hayes traced a finger along the contour lines of the map. "There might be another way in. This ridgeline appears continuous on the map, but I've flown similar terrain in the eastern provinces. Sometimes these formations have narrow gaps that don't appear on satellite imagery." Parker nodded thoughtfully. "Would you be willing to fly a reconnaissance mission today? Verify if such a gap exists?" "Absolutely," Hayes replied without hesitation. "I can be ready in 30 minutes. "I'll arrange for a gunship escort," Parker said. "Area has been quiet, but better safe than sorry." As Parker departed, Hayes turned to Mercer. "I need Valkyrie at 100%. Run a complete system diagnostic while I brief my crew." For the next half hour, Mercer worked with focused intensity, ensuring every system on the aging Black Hawk functioned at optimal levels. Despite its years of service and battle damage, Valkyrie's critical components remained remarkably sound, a testament to Hayes's meticulous maintenance standards. As Mercer completed the final checks, Hayes returned with her flight crew, a gunner and co-pilot who had worked with her on previous missions. "Diagnostic results?" she asked, reviewing the pre-flight checklist. "All systems nominal," Mercer reported. "Hydraulic pressure optimal, navigation systems calibrated, engines running at 97% efficiency. Hayes nodded her approval. Good work. She hesitated, then added, "Would you like to join us? We could use an extra set of eyes on this reconnaissance run." Mercer felt a surge of unexpected pride at the invitation. "Absolutely, Sergeant." 20 minutes later, Valkyrie lifted off from Phobe Condor, accompanied by an Apache gunship providing escort support. Mercer sat behind Hayes in the helicopter's cabin, equipped with binoculars and a tablet displaying detailed terrain maps. As they approached the border region, Hayes maintained constant communication with the Apache, coordinating their search patterns across the rugged landscape. From his position, Mercer could observe her piloting skills firsthand, the subtle adjustments to account for wind currents, the precise control that kept the helicopter stable in turbulent mountain air, the intuitive understanding of how terrain affected flight conditions. "This ridgeline is our focus," Hayes explained over the intercom, indicating a rocky formation that stretched across several miles of harsh terrain. "The target compound lies on the far side. According to the maps, there's no way through, but satellite imagery has limitations in vertical rock formations." For the next hour, they flew systematic patterns along the ridgeline, searching for any gap that might allow a helicopter to pass through undetected. The Apache maintained a higher altitude, providing overwatch and additional surveillance capability. "Nothing so far," the co-pilot reported after completing their third pass. "The ridge appears continuous, just as the maps indicate." Hayes frowned slightly, studying the formations below with experienced eyes. "There's something not right about the shadow patterns on the eastern section. Let's take a closer look." She banked Valkyrie toward a particularly steep portion of the ridge, dropping altitude until they were flying parallel to the rock face. Mercer watched as Hayes navigated with remarkable precision, maintaining a safe distance while scrutinizing every feature of the terrain. "There," she said suddenly, pointing toward what appeared to be a solid rock wall. "See that shadow variation? The light shouldn't bend that way unless there's a gap." Mercer focused his binoculars on the area she indicated. At first, he saw nothing unusual, just the continuous rock face shown on their maps. Then, as the angle of sunlight shifted slightly, he caught it, a narrow vertical shadow that suggested a break in the ridge. "I see it," he confirmed. "Looks like a tight passage, maybe 20 meters wide at most." "Marking the coordinates," the co-pilot said, updating their navigation system. "Should we attempt to verify passage?" Hayes considered. Briefly, affirmative. "We need to confirm it's wide enough for Valkyrie to navigate safely." She radioed the Apache. "Echo 1, we've identified a potential passage through the ridge. Maintaining current position while we investigate." "Copy that, Valkyrie," came the response. "We'll provide overwatch from the south approach." Hayes guided the helicopter toward the narrow opening, reducing speed as they approached. What had appeared as a shadow from a distance revealed itself as a vertical crack in the ridgeline, a natural formation invisible on standard maps and satellite imagery. "Width appears sufficient," Hayes observed as they hovered near the entrance. "Approximately 25 meters at the narrowest point. Enough clearance for rotor diameter with a 5-meter safety margin on either side." "That's cutting it close," the co-pilot commented. "We've managed tighter spaces," Hayes replied with quiet confidence. "Let's verify the exit point." She eased Valkyrie forward into the passage, navigating with exceptional precision between the towering rock walls. Mercer felt his heart rate accelerate as the helicopter entered the narrow gap, rotors seemingly inches from disaster on either side. Yet Hayes maintained perfect control, adjusting for subtle air currents that swirled through the natural tunnel. The passage extended for nearly half a kilometer, twisting slightly before opening to the valley beyond directly behind the target compound. "Jackpot," the co-pilot announced. "We've got visual on the backside of the target location." Completely unobserved from this approach, Hayes allowed herself a small smile of satisfaction. Perfect insertion point for the Special Operations Team. No signs of surveillance or monitoring on this side of the ridge. After documenting the discovery with detailed photographs and precise navigational coordinates, Hayes guided Valkyrie back through the narrow passage and away from the target area. The return to FOB Condor was conducted in professional silence, each crew member processing the implications of what they'd found. Upon landing, Major Parker met them immediately, eager for their report. Hayes briefed him concisely, presenting the evidence of the hidden passage and its tactical advantages for the planned operation. "This changes everything," Parker said, reviewing the photographs. "Instead of a high-risk frontal approach, we can insert the team from behind with minimal chance of detection." He looked at Hayes with newfound respect. "You just significantly increased this mission's chances of success." "Just doing my job, sir," Hayes replied simply. "Your job seems to include finding paths where none appear to exist," Parker observed. "I'm recommending you lead the insertion tomorrow night. Your familiarity with that passage will be crucial for a night operation." Hayes nodded her acceptance of the assignment. "I'll need to modify Valkyrie's lighting system for extreme low visibility conditions. The passage will be treacherous in darkness, even with night vision." "Whatever resources you need are yours," Parker assured her. "This operation is now priority one." Throughout the remainder of the day, Hayes directed a series of modifications to Valkyrie, preparing the helicopter for the demanding night mission ahead. Mercer worked alongside her, marveling at her capacity to anticipate challenges and develop solutions before they became problems. "How did you know to look for that passage?" he asked during a brief break. "The map showed solid rock." Hayes considered her response carefully. "Experience teaches you to question what appears obvious. Maps are created from limited perspectives, satellite imagery, aerial surveys, ground reconnaissance. But mountains have complexities that don't always register on those instruments." She wiped grease from her hands with a rag. "I've flown enough missions in similar terrain to recognize the patterns of geological formations. Some ridges that appear solid often have natural fractures, especially in earthquake zones. But to spot that particular gap from that distance, pattern recognition," Hayes explained. "The way shadows fell, the subtle variation in rock coloration. Details that come from years of observation." She paused, then added, "There's a difference between looking at terrain and seeing it. Most pilots are trained to look. Experience teaches you to see." The wisdom of her statement struck Mercer deeply. It applied not just to helicopter navigation, but to his entire experience at FOB Condor, the difference between looking at Sergeant Hayes and truly seeing who she was beyond appearances. That evening, a special operations team arrived at the Base 6 operators with the quiet confidence and understated professionalism that marked elite soldiers. Their leader, Captain David Wilson, met with Hayes to review the insertion plan, treating her input with the serious consideration it deserved. "That passage is going to be extremely tight, especially in darkness," Wilson noted, studying the reconnaissance photos. "You're confident you can navigate it safely while loaded with my team?" "Yes," Hayes replied without elaboration. Wilson looked at her for a long moment, then nodded once. "Good enough for me. Your reputation precedes you, Sergeant." "What reputation is that?" Hayes asked, genuine curiosity in her voice. "That if Sergeant Hayes says she can fly somewhere, that place exists, regardless of what the maps claim." Wilson smiled slightly. "And that if she says she'll get you out, you can count your life on it." The next day passed in final preparations for the evening mission. Mercer assisted with Valkyrie's specialized modifications, additional night vision compatible lighting, reinforced armor plating around critical systems, and upgraded communications equipment for maintained contact in the mountainous terrain. As sunset approached, Hayes conducted her pre-flight checks with the same methodical precision she brought to every mission, regardless of its significance. There was no outward indication that tonight's operation carried greater importance than routine transport flights. "You seem completely calm," Mercer observed as he helped secure the final equipment. "This is a high-risk mission into completely unmarked terrain. Inserting a team for a classified operation against a high-value target." Hayes looked up from her checklist. "Anxiety doesn't improve performance," she said simply. "Every mission carries risk. Acknowledging it is necessary. Dwelling on it is counterproductive." As the Special Operations team began boarding Valkyrie, Hayes surprised Mercer with an unexpected request. "I'd like you to join us as crew chief for this insertion. Your understanding of Valkyrie's systems could prove valuable if we encounter mechanical issues in that passage." The invitation stunned Mercer. A mission of this significance would normally include only the most experienced personnel. "Are you sure, Sergeant?" "I wouldn't ask if I wasn't," Hayes replied. "You've earned it." 30 minutes later, Valkyrie lifted off into the darkening sky, accompanied by the same Apache gunship that had provided escort during their reconnaissance mission. Mercer sat behind the cockpit, monitoring critical systems while the Special Operations team maintained professional silence in the cabin. Night had fully descended by the time they approached the target area. Hayes flew without standard running lights, using only specialized equipment that was invisible to the naked eye but provided crucial illumination for the crew's night vision systems. "Approaching the ridge passage," Hayes announced over the secure communication system. "Echo 1 will maintain position above the ridgeline. Radio silence once we enter the gap until we reach the insertion point." "Copy that, Valkyrie," the Apache pilot acknowledged. "We'll be monitoring your transponder signal. Good hunting." Mercer felt his heartbeat accelerate as Valkyrie slowed near the entrance to the hidden passage. In daylight, navigating the narrow gap had seemed impressive. In darkness, it appeared nearly impossible, a slightly darker shadow against the black silhouette of the mountain range. Yet Hayes showed no hesitation. With practiced precision, she guided the helicopter into the cove passage, maintaining perfect positional awareness despite the minimal visual references. The rock walls seemed to close in on all sides, creating the unnerving sensation of flying into a solid mountain. The specialization of Hayes's skill became vividly apparent to Mercer during those tense minutes. This wasn't simply good piloting, it was artistry, intuition, and experience combined into something that transcended standard aviation capabilities. She wasn't just operating the helicopter. She was extending her consciousness through it, feeling the terrain through subtle air currents and acoustic reflections. When they emerged from the passage into the valley behind the target compound, Mercer released a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Hayes brought Valkyrie to a hover just above the ground at the pre-designated insertion point, maintaining the helicopter's position with such stability it seemed locked in place. The Special Operations team deployed rapidly, disappearing into the darkness with practiced efficiency. Captain Wilson was last to exit, giving Hayes a respectful nod before vanishing into the night. "Extraction on call," Hayes confirmed. "We'll hold position at the standoff point until you signal." With the team deployed, Hayes guided Valkyrie to a concealed position 2 kilometers from the target area, close enough for rapid response, but far enough to avoid detection. There they waited in disciplined silence, monitoring communications channels for the signal that would indicate mission completion and the need for extraction. Nearly 2 hours passed before the radio crackled to life with a brief coded message: "Package secured. Ready for pickup. Expect company." Hayes immediately brought Valkyrie's systems to full readiness. "Prepare for hot extraction," she instructed the crew. "Possible hostile contact during pickup." As they approached the extraction point, Mercer could see muzzle flashes in the darkness, clear evidence that the operation had not gone undetected. The Special Operations team was engaged in a fighting retreat, moving systematically toward the designated pickup zone while maintaining tactical discipline. Hayes brought Valkyrie directly into the contested area, hovering barely above ground. Level as the team rushed toward the helicopter. Enemy fire intensified, tracer rounds streaking through the darkness around them. Taking fire from multiple positions, the co-pilot reported tensely. Impact on tail section. Maintaining position, Hayes responded, her voice unchanged despite the danger. System still nominal. The Special Operations team boarded rapidly, bringing with them a blindfolded prisoner, presumably the high value target they'd been sent to capture. Captain Wilson was again the last to enter, providing covering fire until he could leap aboard. All personnel secured, he shouted over the roar of gunfire. Go, go, go. Hayes didn't need to be told twice. Valkyrie surged upward, banking sharply away from the most concentrated enemy positions. More rounds struck the helicopter's armored underside, the impacts resonating through the cabin like hammer blows. Direct hit to hydraulic system, Mercer reported, monitoring the warning indicators that flashed on his diagnostic panel. Pressure dropping in secondary circuit. Switching to backup, Hayes responded calmly. Primary system still operational. As they approached the ridge passage, a new threat emerged. Enemy fighters had anticipated their escape route and positioned heavy weapons on the visible approaches. Can't go back the way we came in, the co-pilot warned. They've got the obvious exit points covered. Hayes made an immediate decision. We're still using the passage. They won't expect us to fly through it under fire. That's insane, someone muttered from the cabin. One of the Special Operations team members, though Mercer couldn't identify which one. Captain Wilson overheard the comment. If Hayes says she can do it, she can do it, he stated with absolute conviction. I've seen crazier extractions succeed. The helicopter accelerated toward the narrow gap in the ridge, enemy fire intensifying as they approached. Hayes adjusted their vector repeatedly, using terrain features for partial cover while maintaining their course toward the seemingly impossible escape route. Entering passage in 30 seconds, she announced. Brace for tight maneuvering. What followed was perhaps the most extraordinary display of piloting skill Mercer had ever witnessed. Hayes guided the damaged helicopter into the narrow passage. At speed, navigating by instinct and experience where visual references failed. The rock walls blurred past on either side, sometimes seeming close enough to touch. A sudden explosion rocked the helicopter, a rocket-propelled grenade detonating against the ridge just behind them. Shrapnel damage to tail rotor, Mercer reported, watching critical indicators fluctuate. Vibration increasing beyond normal parameters. Compensating, Hayes replied, adjusting controls to account for the damaged component. The passage seemed to narrow further as they progressed, the damaged tail rotor creating a dangerous oscillation that threatened to slam them into the rock walls. Yet Hayes maintained control, making continuous micro-adjustments that kept them centered in the gap despite deteriorating flight conditions. When they finally emerged from the passage into open air on the far side of the ridge, a collective exhalation of relief filled the cabin. The Apache was waiting, immediately providing covering fire as additional enemy forces attempted to target them from alternate positions. Valkyrie to Echo 1, Hayes transmitted. Package secured. Returning to base. We've sustained damage to hydraulic system and tail rotor assembly. Copy that, Valkyrie, came the response. We'll escort you home. You've got multiple hostiles still attempting pursuit. The return flight to FOB Condor became a test of endurance and skill as Hayes nursed the damaged helicopter across miles of hostile territory. The tail rotor vibration worsened progressively, requiring constant compensation to maintain straight flight. Yet she handled these challenges with the same calm competence she brought to routine operations. When they finally touched down at the base, medical teams rushed forward to secure the captured high-value target. while maintenance crews immediately began assessing Valkyrie's battle damage. Captain Wilson approached Hayes as she completed her shutdown procedures. "That was some of the finest flying I've ever witnessed, Sergeant," he said with genuine admiration. "That passage would have been challenging in daylight with an undamaged aircraft. In darkness under fire with a compromised tail rotor." He shook his head in amazement. "I'm putting you in for a distinguished flying cross, at minimum." Hayes seemed uncomfortable with the praise. "The mission was successful. That's what matters." "The mission was successful because you did the impossible," Wilson countered. "My team is alive because you found a way through when no one else could have." As the Special Operations team departed with their prisoner, Mercer joined the maintenance crew, assessing Valkyrie's damage. The helicopter had sustained multiple hits, including significant damage to the tail rotor assembly and hydraulic systems. Yet somehow, Hayes had kept it flying with the same precision she demonstrated in undamaged aircraft. "She shouldn't have been able to fly through that passage with this level of damage," one of the senior mechanics commented, examining the tail rotor. "The vibration alone should have made it uncontrollable in such tight quarters." "Maybe it's not just about the helicopter," Mercer suggested. "Maybe it's about who's flying it." The next morning, Colonel Blackwood called a special briefing to discuss the operation's success. The captured individual had indeed been a high-value target, a key facilitator between multiple insurgent groups, responsible for coordinating attacks throughout the region. "Last night's operation has significantly disrupted enemy capabilities," Blackwood announced to the assembled personnel. "The intelligence we've already gathered from the target will help prevent numerous planned attacks and potentially save hundreds of lives." He turned to where Hayes sat quietly in the back of the room. "This success would not have been possible without the exceptional skill and courage demonstrated by Sergeant Hayes. Her discovery of an unmarked passage through the ridge enabled the insertion to proceed undetected, and her extraordinary piloting abilities ensured the team's extraction despite heavy enemy resistance and aircraft damage." Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.